Hello and welcome back to what has become a real Halloween tradition on this channel, the annual Alice Cooper reviews. And if you've noticed from the last 2 years, I've mostly avoided talking about Alice's sort of golden age, you know, from 1971 to about 75 or 76, depending on how you mark it off. And I've mostly chosen to concentrate on the weird stuff, you know, the two psychedelic rock albums they released in California in the late 60s and early 70s, or the albums that Alice released in the early 80s when he was hooked on crack and wanted to sound like the Cars meets hard rock. And that's mostly because, you know, for me at least, the weirdness, you know, the stuff that most people wouldn't like is more interesting than the populist hits. But that's not to say that the populist hits aren't amazing. And honestly, as much as I love the early 80s stuff, as much as I love those first two albums, the best Alice Cooper stuff is the stuff from 1971 to 1975. And particularly the albums from 1971 to 1973. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, because I'm going to be reviewing their second 1971 album, Killen. I think the story of the Alice Cooper Band is relatively well known, and I think probably if you're going to be watching a Alice Cooper review, you probably know the story. But the long and the short of it is, the first two albums bombed. They moved to Detroit. I think they were hoping to get some sort of inspiration from the garage rock scene that was happening in Detroit at the time. You know, the Stooges and such like. And Bob Ezrin basically saved them. He cleaned them up. He cut down their sound to something that was really good, and he added this flourish of, you know, excess and really glam that must have sounded very unique at the time. And he more or less single-handedly made them hit makers. It's fascinating when you look at it, because the Alice Cooper group made 4 albums with Ezrin and 3 albums without him. And the 4 albums they made with him are the ones everybody loves. And the 3 albums they made without him are, for the most part, the ones nobody really remembers or cares about. This is one of my favorite album openers ever. The screaming guitars in the intro, that sleazy sax in the verses, the choruses, it's all just amazing. Although the lyrical subject matter is absolutely bizarre. Be My Lover is great. Just fantastic track. Not quite as good as the opener, but still pretty damn good. Although I remember it confused me a lot when I first got the album, because it's actually written from the perspective of one of the band members. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe it actually was written by one of the band members, which would explain that. But it's sung by Alice, and so you kind of wouldn't get that nuance if you just listen to the song, although there is a line that very heavily alludes to it. You know, a lot of the times when glammy bands tried to do longer tracks, it just kind of didn't work for me. Like Roxy Music being a great example. Like pretty much every Roxy Music album I've ever heard, there's one 8 to 9 minute song, but they all kind of tend to drag because they never really change. They're just really the same thing for 8 or 9 minutes. But this is something totally different. Halo of Flies is one of my favorite Alice Cooper songs of all time. And a lot of that is because it's multi-part, and it does its multiple parts really, really well. Lyrically, it's about an individual trying to bring down a Smersh-style James Bond villain faction thing called the Halo of Flies. And there's all kinds of 60s espionage film cliches littered all over the lyrics of this track. It's actually interesting to note that for all that people remember the Alice Cooper group as being horror-themed and this perfect Halloween band, they were actually almost as fixated on James Bond. They did at least 3 songs I can think of that directly reference espionage flicks and stuff like James Bond in the lyrics. And then there's another track, I think on Billion Dollar Babies, that doesn't mention it lyrically, but there's a riff on the James Bond theme during a jam section. But anyway, As I think I indicated, this is a multi-part epic. about 8.5 minutes long. Supposedly, the band had been listening to a lot of King Crimson at the time, and this was their attempt to prove that they were as good as the prog guys and they could do something like that. And you know, it's not up there with any of the great prog epics, but you know, as far as lengthy multi-part epics written by people outside of prog, this is definitely one of the best. This track is pretty interesting. It's not necessarily one of my favorites, but I like it, you know. Lyrically, it's a tribute to Jim Morrison of The Doors, who had died earlier in that year, and who I guess the band had known during their LA days. And in fact, if you listen to the intro to the song, you can hear that Alice's vocals are really, really trying to sound like Jim Morrison's. Although, interestingly enough, if you didn't know that this song was about Jim Morrison, I don't really know that you would have made the connection, because otherwise it's pretty much just a straightforward song about a Western Hollywood figure, as the title would kind of indicate. You Drive Me Nervous is probably the track on the album I tend to forget. It's not exactly a bad song at all. I actually think it's pretty good in the big scheme of things, but it just, in the context of the album, it feels a little fillerish. It's just that in the context of the album, it tends to feel a little bit fillerish, which is ironic because most bands would kill to write songs this good. Now, I mentioned this in my Alice Cooper band retrospective that I did 2 years ago with a friend of mine, but I have never been able to figure out, you know, whether I heard this on the radio as a kid or whether somebody else ripped off the chord progressions and the music for this song and had a hit with it. Because both options are very possible. But whatever the case, I definitely heard this track before I bought the album, one way or the other. You know, maybe I just didn't realize it was Alice Cooper, or like I said, maybe somebody ripped it off. Either way, fantastic song, very memorable, but it's all just building up to what comes next. This track is titled in such a way that it's basically designed to provoke controversy. But the joke's on you if you get upset about it, because lyrically it's actually played very straight, and it's a song about the tragic consequences of parents neglecting their children. It's also another fairly long song, but what always impresses me most is that intro. With slightly different production, that intro could be on a 90s alt record. You know, I always think of something like Alice in Chains or maybe even Soundgarden. Now, as for the rest of the song, it's amazing. Probably my favorite song on the album aside from Halo of Flies. And a lot of that is because of the genuinely creepy atmosphere that the song builds up and maintains over its running time. I don't know if there's another Alice Cooper group song that is as consistently eerie as this. Maybe the Ballad of Dwight Fry, but... So we end the album with the roughly 7-minute epic, Killer, which is not as good as Halo of Flies. I don't even really think it's as good as Dead Babies, to tell you the truth, which rolls right into it at the end. But it's still fantastic. It's a story about a convicted killer being executed, and, you know, another multi-part song. You know, like I said, there's not a whole lot to say here. I actually don't really like it all that much, but it's still a fantastic closer for the album. Especially that sequence at the end where they execute the killer and then the weird noises that close out the album. So that was Killer. Probably the best out of the original albums put out by the group, although I do realize, you know, there's about 3 or 4 of them that are so good that it's kind of splitting hairs between when you try to say which one is the best. Some people like Billion Dollar Baby's the best. A lot of people like School's Out the best. I even know some people who like the first 2 the best. But anyway, this is my personal favorite. I cannot recommend it strongly enough. And yeah, so happy Halloween. I'm sorry this video went up so late. That's on me. and I'll try to get more content to you soon, but I'm making no promises.